What if I told you that the institution created to clean up corruption and capture is now itself accused of becoming part of the problem? This is not a politician, not the police, the anti-corruption unit itself.
At paragraph 11, I deny these allegations. I expand on this denial as follows hereunder.
So I'm Connie the Hunter, and I've spent the past 15 years covering South Africa's criminal justice system, the state capture years, and the people who have been tasked with cleaning up that mess. And honestly, I don't think enough people understand why what's happening inside the Investigating Directorate Against Corruption, or IDAC, is such a big deal.
This is not a VIP visiting IDAC office.
No, this was my friend.
This is a personal visit by a friend.
I referenced how you address each other, either calling each other gorgeous, you tell each other how much you miss each other.
Actually, many people didn't even know what IDAC was before the Madlanga Commission. Now, this is not just another political scandal. This is about whether South Africa still has an institution capable of investigating corruption without becoming caught in corruption itself. And to understand how we got here, we have to go way back. Way, way back. Imagine it's 2018. South Africa has just lived through almost a decade of state capture. The Zondo Commission is hearing testimony almost every day. Billions of rands have disappeared. State-owned companies have been hollowed out. They've been looted. Politicians, business people, they've been police officers, government officials. Everyone seems to have been implicated. And South Africans are asking one simple question: who's going to jail? Now, the problem was that the institution responsible for prosecuting corruption didn't inspire much confidence. The National Prosecuting Authority had spent years battling allegations of political interference, leadership instability, and internal factionalism. So many of the biggest corruption cases weren't moving. Others had collapsed, and public confidence was running dangerously low. So government, on the advice of some people in civil service, judges, decided that something had to change. And in 2019, President Cyril Ramaphosa established something called the Investigating Directorate, or simply the ID. Its job was straightforward: to investigate the biggest corruption cases, especially those coming out of the Zondo Commission. So you think of it as South Africa's state capture unit. It wasn't permanent. It was created as a specialized unit inside the National Prosecuting Authority that ordinary structures of the NPA were just not equipped to handle. But then almost immediately, everyone realized something: that if South Africa was serious about fighting corruption, this measure, this unit, cannot be temporary. It needed resources. It needed specialist investigators. It needed forensic accountants, cyber experts, data analysts, and perhaps most importantly, it needed independence. So then comes 2022. And this is when President Cyril Ramaphosa announced that the Investigating Directorate would become permanent. It was on the recommendation of the Zondo Commission to make that ID unit. And then the Investigative Directorate became the Investigating Directorate Against Corruption, or IDAC. So it wasn't just a name change, it was a complete upgrade. For the first time, the unit was given its own police powers, which means it could conduct criminal investigations itself. It could recruit specialist investigators. It could employ forensic experts. It could work alongside prosecutors from the beginning of an investigation, instead of relying entirely on the police, who does the investigation and then hands over a docket to prosecutors. Because by then, many South Africans had lost confidence in parts of the police, especially when it came to investigating corruption involving senior officials and top politicians. So IDAC was supposed to be different. It was supposed to be protected from political interference, from factional battles, and protected from exactly the kind of institutional collapse that had plagued the criminal justice system for years. And in many ways, it became South Africa's last great anti-corruption experiment. But there was only one problem. Building a new institution is one thing, but finding the right people to lead it is something else entirely. And that's where Advocate Andrea Johnson enters the story. Actually, I remember the first time I really paid attention to her. It was in 2018. I was sitting inside the union buildings covering interviews for South Africa's next National Director of Public Prosecutions at the time. And one by one, candidates walked into the room to convince the panel that they were the right person to rebuild the National Prosecuting Authority. Then Andrea Johnson had walked in. I'd seen her before. She had worked on some of South Africa's most high-profile prosecutions, including those involving former National Police Commissioner Jackie Selebe, but I particularly remembered her from Oscar Pistorius and that case. This interview was different. She was for like 2.5 hours. She fielded difficult questions about prosecutorial independence, about political interference, leadership, even the future of the NPA, right? What struck me wasn't that she had all the answers. I think what struck me at the time was that she genuinely understood the NPA. She had been there for more than 20 years at the time. She spoke about serving the Constitution, about acting without fear, favor, or prejudice. She spoke about the importance of prosecutors remaining independent from politicians, and I saw how the room responded to her. She even reflected on how she had personally experienced political interference during her career and why that it should never be allowed to happen. Ultimately, she didn't get the job at the time. Shamila Batohi was ultimately appointed the National Director of Public Prosecutions. But Johnson's reputation only continued to grow. And it really wasn't difficult to see why. She had spent more than 2 decades climbing through the ranks in the NPA. She wasn't an outsider, right? She started at court level. She had built her career inside the institution. Before that, she had been part of the Scorpions, which is arguably South Africa's most feared crime-fighting unit in the early 2000s. And the Scorpions had a reputation of going after powerful people, politicians, business leaders, senior police officials. Nobody was supposed to be untouchable. And so Johnson wasn't just another prosecutor at the Scorpions. She became one of its senior leaders. She supervised major investigations. She helped develop investigating strategies. She worked on organized crimes. I remember her talking about mining syndicates, gang violence, construction in extortion, even financial crime. She was part of all of these big cases. So South Africa's response to the international concerns around money laundering, you remember the grey listing stuff, she was there, right? And this was not someone learning on the job. She had spent decades preparing exactly for this moment. Then came 2022, where Advocate Hermione Crinier resigned as the head of the then Investigative Directorate, or ID, after repeatedly warning about limited budgets, bureaucracy, an enormous challenge investigating state capture with too little resource.
I found that the space wasn't there for me to implement the things that I thought should be implemented. And I will give you a few examples, but you know, I was first struck by the levels of dysfunction that I thought I was seeing in the NPA.
She said she was frustrated, and then that job suddenly became available. So Andrea Johnson was the obvious choice. She inherited an impossible assignment because South Africans really at that time wanted accountability. Then the Zondo Commission had produced thousands of pages detailing corruption and how it infiltrated the state. People wanted to see arrests, people wanted to see trials, people wanted convictions, orange overalls. That was the word at the time. Instead, Johnson inherited an institution was leading an institution that was still trying to build itself, right? Imagine trying to fly an aeroplane, and while you're still bolting the wings onto it, there was an expectation that she had to now fly this plane. So that's what leading the ID at the time was, right? She had to recruit people, systems still had to be developed, technology had to be procured. They had to still figure out where the budget of all of this was going to come from. And meanwhile, the public wanted results immediately. So then in 2024, things changed. The Investigative Directorate officially became the Investigating Directorate Against Corruption, IDAC. And this wasn't just a symbolic moment, it was a statement to say, hey, government was saying, this is our flagship anti-corruption institution. It's going to be targeted. It's going to be insulated. And this is the body that will investigate the country's biggest corruption cases. This is where South Africans should place their trust. That was the message at the time. And now IDAC had full police powers. They had specialist investigators, they had forensic experts, they had cyber people, the ability to run prosecution-led investigations from start to finish. But that was just on paper. On paper, this was exactly what South Africans had been asking for. An institution that was built specifically to fight corruption, led, we thought at the time, by one of the country's most experienced prosecutors. Everything pointed to success, which is exactly why what happened next became so shocking. Because within a year, the anti-corruption agency itself would become the story. In the beginning, for the first few years, most people didn't pay much attention to IDAC. It quietly investigated some of South Africa's biggest corruption cases while trying to build itself into a permanent institution. We didn't really know what actually was happening in IDAC. But then almost overnight, everything changed. Because South Africa's anti-corruption unit, this IDAC, suddenly found itself at the center of one of the country's biggest policing/political scandals. It began with this remarkable press conference. In July 2025, KwaZulu-Natal Police Commissioner Lieutenant General Nhlanhla Mkhwanazi publicly accused IDAC of operating as part of what he described as a rogue faction within law enforcement. He alleged that the unit was targeting senior police officials while protecting others and had become involved in the very factional battles it was asked to investigate.
There is now this war, and he reiterated that comment to say that there's a war between IDAC and the SAPS.
This was done without the authority of the National Commissioner, nor I, as a Provincial Commissioner, was never informed. God knows why.
Those were explosive allegations. Until then, IDAC had largely been viewed as the institution investigating corruption. Now it was the institution being accused, and at the center of controversy was the arrest of crime intelligence head Lieutenant General Dumisani Khumalo. Now, IDAC alleged that Khumalo and several senior crime intelligence officials had manipulated appointments inside crime intelligence to unlawfully access public funds. When asked about this, I remember Johnson telling Parliament that investigators had uncovered evidence suggesting the appointments form part of a broader scheme for private gain. But Mkhwanazi told a very different story. He argued that the timing of those arrests were not a coincidence. According to him, the case had been prioritized to disrupt sensitive crime intelligence investigations and ongoing work by the Political Killings Task Team, also known as the PKTT. Now, those allegations are strongly disputed by IDAC. Later, Johnson told members of Parliament that the Directorate only became aware that Khumalo coordinated the PKTT after the arrests had already taken place. She, at the time, rejected suggestions that the investigations were designed to interfere with other police operations. So now, these allegations were made, and the Madlanga Commission is trying to examine many of these claims against IDAC. But the controversy does not stop there. Attention soon shifted from IDAC, the institution, to its leader, where members of Parliament questioned Advocate Andrea Johnson about her husband's employment in crime intelligence and her role on the interview panel that recommended his appointment.
How did you know that your husband was going to be shortlisted? Didn't you influence that your husband must be shortlisted?
I accept that in hindsight, Honourable Member, I should have, but because I didn't go into his shortlisting and the actual interview for him, I didn't see the prejudice because the panelists were more than capable of arriving at a finding. I take your point.
Now, Johnson had acknowledged that she had disclosed the relationship at the time, but she conceded that actually in hindsight she should have recused herself completely from the interview process. She was also questioned about a relationship she had developed with senior figures inside crime intelligence. Now, she rejected those allegations at the time, and she said she just had professional relationships with people at crime intelligence, and it did not influence IDAC's work. She told Parliament that she and her husband deliberately avoided discussing work because of the sensitive positions they occupied, and insisted that professional boundaries had always been maintained. Now, whether those explanations will be accepted by the Madlanga Commission is still to be seen. But at this stage, something much bigger happened. The public conversation was no longer about the corruption and the cases that IDAC was investigating. Since Mkonazi's allegations and the subsequent investigations, the conversation was now about South Africa's corruption agency itself and whether or not it could be trusted. And that's a dangerous place for any institution to find itself. Anti-corruption agencies do not simply rely on successful prosecutions, right? They rely on credibility. They rely on the belief that they investigate without fear, favor, or political allegiance. Now, the moment that credibility comes into question, every investigation they undertake becomes vulnerable to suspicion. And that is exactly where IDAC now finds itself. The institution, created to restore public confidence in the criminal justice system, is now fighting to defend confidence in itself. So the allegations that IDAC was used to manipulate investigations, to pursue investigations and prosecute people in crime intelligence for nefarious agendas still stand. And what it's done now is not only broken down those particular cases against Dumisani Khumalo and others, as well as the National Police Commissioner Fani Masimola, but what it has done now, it has taken the whole institution and brought about questions whether or not it is independent and is acting without fear, favor, or prejudice. And that is where the danger lies. Can IDAC survive? So let's take a minute. Where does all of this leave us? The easiest thing to do would be to make this story about Andrea Johnson. To some degree it is, but it's not entirely. Andrea Johnson has had a fall from grace. Now, the question is about what happens to the cases she pursued as IDAC head against crime intelligence and the police commissioner. So, can IDAC survive? After all of the bombshell allegations and evidence led at the Madlanga Commission against IDAC and against Andrea Johnson, she has since resigned. Some of the people who were closest to her in IDAC are now facing suspensions, and there's a big question about the motive of their actions. There's some people, some of her subordinates, that are saying she actually lied under oath. There are questions about whether she should be charged for perjury, she should face other charges. The cases against Dumisani Khumalo and Fani Masimola seem to be quite limp, and it looks like those cases are going to fall apart. Think about why South Africa created IDAC in the first place. That's super important to what happens next. It wasn't created because the country needed another investigative unit. We had the Hawk, you have the SIU, you have so many other units. It was because people had stopped trusting parts of the criminal justice system. The National Prosecuting Authority had been battered by years of political interference. And so the Scorpions had been disbanded, the Hawks were struggling to convince South Africans that they could investigate corruption without fear or favor. And so government and the president created something new, something permanent, something with specialist investigators, full policing powers, something that was supposed to stand above politics. It was meant to be the institution that restored faith in all the others. And that's why this moment feels so significant, because once the anti-corruption agency itself becomes the subject of allegations, especially as big as this, the damage extends beyond a single investigation. This is not only about Dumisani Khumalo and his co-accused. Every single future case becomes vulnerable to the same question. If IDAC comes after me, I can say, hey, there may be an alternative motive. So then the question is this prosecution based purely on evidence, or is there something else happening behind the scenes? And that uncertainty is dangerous, not just for IDAC, but for South Africa's entire criminal justice system. The irony is difficult to ignore. IDAC was created because the criminal justice system had become infected by factional battles. Now it's been accused of being caught up in those very same battles involving rogue characters, crime intelligence, and history has a strange way of repeating itself. South Africa has repeatedly responded to institutional failure by creating new institutions. Now, when one structure loses credibility, we build another. Scorpions, and then you have the Hawks, and then you had IDAC. But perhaps the real lesson is that institutions are only as strong as the culture that surrounds them. If the broader criminal justice system remains vulnerable to political interference, to factionalism and internal power struggles, then even the best designed institutions will eventually come under pressure. And so this is not about angels versus demons. It's about whether South Africa has finally built an anti-corruption institution capable of resisting the pressures that have weakened so many before it. The Madlanga Commission will finish its work. It will make findings. We will know, what was the motives or what was not the motives. The courts will decide the criminal cases before them. Those prosecutions will take its course. But whatever those outcomes may be, there's a reality, an indisputable reality that has already emerged, and that IDAC's reputation has taken a significant knock. And restoring public confidence may prove harder than winning any corruption case. Because institutions don't derive their authority from legislation alone. Let's not forget that. They derive it from legitimacy. And legitimacy is built on public trust. Once that trust begins to fracture, rebuilding it can take years. So this goes beyond Advocate Andrea Johnson. The real question is whether IDAC can still be what South Africa created it to be, or whether it has become another institution struggling against the very disease it was established to cure. What do you think? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to like and subscribe.